All right. Well, first of all, let me say thanks for letting me be part of this summit. This is a fantastic group of people. I got to tell you, I've looked at the list of everybody involved in this, and this is a big topic because what we're really endeavoring on in this virtual neurology summit right now, what we're looking at, what we're going through is the sheer fact that neurological disorders, whether they be degenerative or developmental, is taking over really the world financially, uh, taking away skills and talents and people who can contribute to the workforce. And so I think it's very important that I give this talk, and that is really about pediatrics and about pediatrics who go through inflammatory situations and those that go through inflammatory situations that develop neurological issues, and then they get neurological issues and they get developmental delays, or they get deemed as autistic, or they get deemed as mentally ill. And so what I wanted to do is really take the time to go through this and just talk about it a little bit, give you an idea of what we do, how we evaluate things, and what we look at in our clinic whenever it comes to these children with these pediatric autoimmune encephalitic conditions. They can become devastating. The hyperkinetic stuff, the OCD, the tics, even sometimes the tremors, the Sydenham stuff. It even goes beyond that to bedwetting and to multiple other conditions, nightmares, temper tantrums. Sometimes it might be neurologic in nature. So it's important to learn these things if you're going to be in the world of functional medicine or functional neurology or integrative care, or whatever it is you want to call it. This is an important thing. So just real quick about myself, I'm Dr. Brandon Brock. I live in Dallas, Texas. I'm a nurse practitioner. I have a doctorate degree from Duke University. I'm also a chiropractor. I got a doctorate degree from Parker University. And I have a postdoctorate degree in research from Harvard University. And we'll be starting medical school this year. So it's a great time to be learning. And it's a great time to be able to take all this information that's going to be given in this summit and put it together so that you can become the best neurology practitioner that you can be. Now, I like to start out and kind of get people limbically involved, and this is one of my wonderful patients. And as you can see, I'll move my cursor right here. Sometimes I'll pull the pen out. You can see this beautiful smile that she has right here. You can see this beautiful look in her eyes. And right here, you can see the fact that she is a happy girl and out playing. But at one point in time, this girl was the equivalent of Linda Blair. And some of you may not know who that is, but it's the girl that played in The Exorcist. She screamed so loud, in fact, that everybody left my office one day. She screamed so loud that I basically almost put my hand over her mouth. As a result of learning about what you're going to learn about, and not just my class, but in all these other classes, this girl has her life back. Now, I want you to take that for a second. I want you to kind of digest that. She has her life back. Her family now has their life back. They don't have to wonder anymore about what's wrong with this child. They don't have to wonder anymore about what they're going to do to make things better. They don't have to spend hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. They have their family back together. So she had pediatric autoimmune neuropsychiatric disease related to strep, or she had autoimmune encephalitis that's pediatric, whatever you want to call it. She had an infection that turned into inflammation, that turned into autoimmunity, that turned into neuroautoimmunity. So in the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to take you through the steps of how we kind of figured some of that out. So the first thing that we have to look at is, why in the world does any of this inflammation even start? So what is the trigger? So if you look at this right here, it's the trigger. It's the underlying condition. Could it be the GI system making inflammation? Could it be an infection in the GI system? Could it be blood sugar? Could it be insulin? Could it be thyroid? Could it be an infectious disease? In her case, it was an infectious disease. It was strep. She did have a strep infection. So all of these things can really create and activate genetic responses. They create inflammation, and then there can be these epitopes made where one tissue now looks like another tissue related to the immune system, and now instead of attacking this one, you attack both. And it can become absolutely destructive when you do that. It lowers the energy production of the cell, and now you get excitotoxic because it may spontaneously fire and die out. So you got your work cut out for you as a neurological practitioner because you had to prevent this. So if you don't find the trigger, it will perpetuate a tissue immune tissue cycle. For instance, the brain-gut, gut-brain loop. So unless we put sort of a crowbar in that wheel and stop it from spinning, it will spin out of control and the person will become chronically ill. And that's what a lot of our chronically ill patients are. So we've got triggers. Some of the triggers: autoimmunity and inflammation. We've just talked about that. And autoimmunity is when the body attacks itself. And there's really not enough time in this lecture for me to go through autoimmunity, but it's a very heavy topic where people start to basically eat themselves. And inflammation is an inflammatory process, and whenever it goes wrong and it goes out of control, it can become an autoimmune process. And in this autoimmune and inflammatory process, we have energy production loss, because when you have inflammation, you lose the ability for the mitochondria to make energy. The cell walls become unstable, calcium influxes into the cell, and everything can die. So we get tissue death cycles, especially whenever we get energy production loss, autoimmunity. So now a tissue is attacked, there's cytokines released, there's inflammation, there is now tissue death. And in Aubrey's case, the girl I just showed you, she had it to her basal ganglia, and in particular to the part of the basal ganglia that made the stop button go. And so now she became constantly on the go, and she became hyperkinetic. And so just the slightest emotional outburst or the slightest emotional input would make her basal ganglia, the direct pathway, go crazy, and she couldn't inhibit it with her indirect pathway, and she would end up going bonkers. And so we had to do something with retraining the frontal lobe, controlling autoimmunity, controlling inflammation, activating the hyperdirect pathway, and putting it all together. And she's basically a normal child. So we need linear paths to treat this, but we can't treat it really until what we understand some of the triggers are. So I like this picture. Here's your reference for this. This is really about neural tight junctions, leaky intestines, and so forth. And you can see there's sort of three layers here. We've got our microbial layer, then we've got our cellular layer, and then we have our subcellular activity that can occur. So let's talk about this layer first, and that is, we can have microbes, toxins, proteins, food-derived exophorins, and really then we can have this layer right here, which is the mucosal layer, where we can break zonulins, occludins, vinculins, all these different types of things that control these gap junctions, and then actinomycin, which goes through the middle. And then we've got these subcellular structures down here, which have to be in control so that you don't get an abnormal antigen response or abnormal antigen exposure as a result of a breach through this barrier system. And then down here, if all of this goes crazy, we can get inflammation. It can become systemic. Now we can get mimicry, which is autoimmunity. We can get imbalance, which can perpetuate the autoimmunity. It can get in the circulatory system, go through the blood-brain barrier, and now we get things like neurological disorders. So I like this picture because it summarizes things very, very well, and it's very well referenced, and it's a good paper. So looking at the big picture here. So lifestyle, diet, exposure, infection, medication, gastrointestinal, food, hormones. This right here is a diagram that I made supported by a paper about transcription of inflammation, and I'll tie this together here in a second. Any of these things that are off, so if you have a child like Aubrey that I just showed you, where her lifestyle, where she has massive problems, any of these little things could tip her the wrong direction. It can make chronic inflammation. And over here, if you look at this reference that I gave you on NF-kappa B, When you get any of these activation signals, you can see them right here, it will activate intracellular kinases that make something called NF-kappa B that allow messenger RNA to get transcribed into inflammatory proteins. So these inflammatory proteins can impair the immune system. They can make persistent inflammation. It can cause cellular dysfunction. It can become chronic. You can have reactive oxygen species, which is basically free radical damage. And now we can really get heart disease, cancer, diabetes, neurodegenerative disorders, gastrointestinal or autoimmune disease. One of the other things that I would add in there is that you can get chronic joint pain, chronic muscle pain. You can get vascular changes to your musculature, and as a result, you end up getting cramping or inefficient function or fatigue. Of course, if you got a great immune system, it can be resolved, tissues get repaired, and everything is great. Sometimes nutrition is needed, nutrition is adequate. Sometimes there's no need for care. Sometimes medication is needed. Tissue did not recover. And if the tissue did not recover, that's when medication is needed. So for instance, if the thyroid has Hashimoto's and it's been damaged to the point to where the tissue can no longer be repaired, sometimes you need medication in order to substitute the fact that the gland cannot have any more output, and nutrition is not going to repair that organ because it's been too damaged. So I really like this slide because it shows you a systematic way to think through, do I need medication? Do I need nutrition? Or is there another problem? And if there's another problem, which one of these problems do I have to sort of work my way through? And so here they are. And again, I like to give references. So step 1, triggers. There they are. You've seen them. So we've got to go through these triggers. Sometimes that we have to look at these. So there's different lab companies that can look for all of the infectious diseases. Of course, there's lab companies that can look at insulin and blood sugar and blood glucose. Of course, there's labs that can look at thyroid function. There's labs that can look at gut function and gut dysbiosis, gut infection. There's labs that can look at the immune system, immune markers, and so forth. So all of these triggers can really be marked or found by labs. You just really have to know which avenue to go down. Now with Aubrey, the girl that I showed you at the beginning, we knew she had like 25 throat infections. We knew that she was very, very ill. She had to have her tonsils and adenoids taken out, and it was pretty clear that she had at least a microbial-induced type of pathology that created inflammation, that created autoimmunity, that created mimicry, that went to her basal ganglia, and her brain wouldn't stop. That was one of the things that happened to her. Now, whenever that happens, it created inflammation all over her, so her joints hurt. She got arthralgia, she got myalgia, she got all kinds of neurological stuff going on, and some doctors even called her mentally ill, which could have decimated her if she would have been stuck with that label for the rest of her life. So here we have it. These are the triggers: dietary proteins, okay? Abnormal enzymes in the gut, not breaking things down, sometimes antibiotics, making dysbiosis, infections, we just talked about those, blood sugar issues and insulin issues, okay, antibodies to the gut itself, food allergens, toxins, endocrine disorders, stress is a big one, pregnancy, but any of these can make the gut leaky to where now undigested proteins or other types of molecular structures can get through and now create inflammation, autoimmunity, can breach the blood-brain barrier. Anything goes. Lots of bad things can happen to the patient. But what I want you to really look at this point is these triggers right here. So when your patients come in and they have these chronic illnesses, these myalgias, these chronic pain, suffering, and other neurological components, please look at some of the triggers and figure out what it is. Because if you don't figure out what it is and get rid of it and just treat the end result, which is the symptom, you may miss the entire picture, which is the trigger and the journey that got you to that symptom. That's called medicine. And sometimes it's a backwards journey. So the functional medicine practitioner sometimes goes to the trigger and alleviates the symptom. Sometimes an allopathic practitioner goes to the symptom and never works backwards, but they just try to cover it up. Meanwhile, the underlying problem is still there. So something to think about. So food and stress and infection and microbiome and intolerance and all that stuff are a really big deal. You'll see in just a second. One of the things that we see here is just stress. And as a result of stress, we damage our adrenals. And as a result of damaging our adrenals, we have abnormal cortisol. And as a result of having abnormal cortisol, we damage our gut layer. Okay. And as a result of that, the gut flora may come through. And now TNF alpha may go up, our pain may go up, we may get mast cell depolarization. All of this stuff can trigger our limbic system and destroy the ability of the frontal lobe to inhibit our limbic system, so we become limbically driven creatures. It becomes anxiety, maybe it becomes depression, maybe even panic attacks, or just abnormal behavior or function, what we would call mental illness. One of the things that I have that causes, or that I have in my patient population that causes anxiety the most is SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, is very, very notorious for creating anxiety, at least in my patient population. So here's a lab that just shows a couple of things. This person's DQ2, DQ8 positive. They're at a risk for developing celiac disease. They've also got a high level of total IgE, which is usually could be signs of, let's just say, an environmental infection. Now, one thing I do want to say is if your IgEs are up because of environmental infections, if your IgG levels are also up, they will further drive your IgEs. So a food intolerance that's not anaphylactic will drive your allergies. So just keep that in mind. So that's positive, that's positive. We come through over here, and now really, if we look down a little bit further, this person has intestinal permeability. So they have zonulin pathology, and they have lipopolysaccharides, probably from an infectious disease that's breaking down the zonulins, and the zonulins are the little gates between the cells that keep things from coming through. Now, you can measure total zonulin, or you can measure zonulin antibody and so forth. So these are both not so good. And so we don't like it when we see an infectious pathogen, or possibly the byproduct of an infectious pathogen, creating damage to the gut lining, because that can allow things to become leaky. It comes into the system, creates inflammation, and goes all the way down the line to possible molecular mimicry. So we have lysis of a gram-negative bacteria. It creates lipopolysaccharides. Okay, we call those PAMPs. There's PAMPs, there's DAMPs, there's all kinds of things. But they bind, okay, and we end up getting macrophage activation, and we end up getting cytokines produced, and it activates blood clotting, inflammation, and then activation of complement pathways, because we have to have complement in order to trigger the immune system. So this is not really the best thing in the world to happen to you unless you have a need for it. If it's happening and there's not a need for it, then obviously there's a problem. But I'm just kind of showing you how LPSs from gram-negative bacteria can lead to macrophage activation, and you end up eating the lining of your own gut. Okay, so you can see it right here. All of these guys come through. If dendritic cells activate a naive T cell, you can activate a B cell. Now, Th1 can come and just straight up eat it. Th2 can activate a B cell, and we end up getting activation that way. Th17 now makes it go to other systems, and you get cross-reactivity. Okay, so we don't like Th17. You've got to have it to preserve a little bit of your mucosal layer. But again, Th1 straight activation, Th2 B cell antibody, interleukin 6, 12, and TNF alpha. Of course, TNF alpha here too. And then if we get IL-17, that's just the guy that makes you cross-react, and you get multi-system disorders, and you can end up having cross-reactivity and molecular mimicry. So as we look through here, these are all gluten or celiac markers, okay? And then these are all the components of gluten right here. And you can see some of the previous studies on this patient right here. It's really pretty interesting. There's quite a few markers that are in the red. So anyway, we have, let's just go through this. Here's a zonulin. We have an aminated gliadin that comes in. It becomes deaminated, okay? And then what can happen is if we have the HLA-DQ2 or 8 genetic malformation or genotype, it can end up reacting with CD4 T cells, which make a B cell, which activates a plasma cell, and now we get antibodies to tissue transglutaminase, which is what deaminates the gluten in the first place, and this is one of the ways that we get celiac disease. It can really come up and damage this lining and start to create chronic villus atrophy. So you don't want that, because if you do, it's going to make it to where you're intolerable to food, you're going to get inflamed, you're going to get cross-reactivity, and you're going to be at a higher probability for autoimmunity. All right, so we don't just look at gluten and all the components, we also look at serpins and ferrinins and globulins and purinins. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. These 5 proteins are all found in wheat. Okay, so it's not just, alpha gliadins anymore. There's much more to look at. For instance, serpins deal with hormone conversion, tumor suppression, hormone transportation, viral and parasite pathogens, cell differentiation, cell migration, protein folding. All these things, if these guys are abnormal, can be screwed up. And this is right out of October 2011 as a reference. We have proteases here, which are also measured. Proteases inhibit various things, and if they are not working, then it can allow for damage to occur. These dendritic cells are really interesting. I'll just tell you a quick story. These dendritic cells, these are not like dendrites like in the nervous system. They're in the submucosal layer. And what they do is they reach up through the gap junction and they sample food and then bring it back down and then basically determine if they like it or not. If they don't, they go activate a naive T cell, and then it creates an inflammatory cascade or barrage. So proteases deal with mucus cleavage, Ig cleavage, inflammatory mediator processing, tight junction degradation. These guys are important for a lot of what goes on in that gut layer. So this is a reference right out of 2016. So right here we have vinculins, and this is another test. And then we have ferritin, iron. This is just an anemia panel right here for the patient. A lot of times if they get malabsorption because of celiac problems, they end up getting malabsorption, and it's not hard to get anemias. And if they get anemias, there's no oxygen going to the brain, and if there's no oxygen going to the brain, you have very quick metabolic failure and very poor recovery or plasticity. Okay, so some of the triggers, we've got these Bacteroides, these are Firmicutes, and these Proteobacteria. Right here you can see person has gram-positive, gram-negative bacteria. Their diversity index is off. They're prone for gut dysbiosis and obesity, and this is by looking at a microbiome breakdown, per se. We have more here. We have these guys right here that are all involved in tight junction integrity. We have some of these that are involved in atherosclerosis. And then irritable bowel, which is really SIBO markers. Okay, so resolving some of these triggers, it may take usage of supplements, dietary changes, medications, mind, body, spirit, all of these things. You, as the clinician, are going to have to figure out what the trigger is and then get rid of the trigger if you want to stop the inflammation so that the tissues don't get destroyed. All right? So if you don't know a trigger, treating inflammation will persist. So sometimes it's kind of silly just to treat inflammation if you don't treat the trigger. If you resolve the trigger, you can take less product or cycle it. Removing triggers is the greatest part of reducing chronic disease because you stop the cause, and so the net result at the end is something that will slow down. So stop the triggers, reduce the inflammation, you're going to be a lot better. So control food and stress, control vagal output, control stomach acid. Some nutrients do that. Control the gallbladder and enzymes. Control the microflora. Control the lining. Control the immune system and don't let it get out of control. Get your Treg cells really, really good. Don't get immune polarized. And in this case with Aubrey, there's going to be interaction with the brain. So you're going to have to stop the trigger, stop the inflammation, and help the brain. Okay? So step 2, real quick, cellular responses. We've got this guy right here. We've already talked about triggers. Let's talk about cellular responses and so forth. So what leaves the gut's going to hurt the body, especially if it's undigested, unbroken down, or not broken down into a way where the body's going to recognize it, okay? Energy mechanisms are going to die and you're going to get inflamed. So this is really nice because you get inflammation, cytokines, mitochondria lose energy, you get free radicals, you get inducible nitric oxide, the sarcolemma of the muscle gets damaged, you hurt. Fibromyalgia, okay? All the way down to contractile proteins, to mitochondria, to protein synthesis, to proteolysis. This is free radical mediated skeletal muscle dysfunction and inflammatory conditions. So any of the inflammatory things I've talked about creates energy problems, inducible nitric oxide, free radicals, and all of the components of muscle breakdown. And not only that, your descending serotonergic, your descending opioid, your descending noradrenergic systems fail. So those wide dynamic neurons in the back of the spinal cord are not inhibited. So every time you move or you do something, you just end up getting pain. You can get peripheral sensitization, central desensitization, and this inflammatory system will sensitize the peripheral system and damage the ability to stop things centrally. So chronic inflammation, all stages of cancer, neurological diseases, diabetes, pulmonary disease is a big one. Bone and joint disease, you wouldn't believe, like osteoporosis and osteopenia is pretty much autoimmune. Metabolic disorders and autoimmune disorders with the guts, cardiovascular disease, this one right here will get so many people. If you have inflammation, foam cells, highly reactive CRP or highly sensitive CRP, fibrinogen, homocysteine, all those things mixed together with the carrier molecules that are not there to get rid of the cholesterol if they're all messed up, and you have the genotypes which create phenotypic expression, you're gonna probably end up with some cardiovascular or some atherosclerosis. So that's important to do and to look at. So why does inflammation matter? So NF-kappa B, it goes into the cell, okay? It produces interleukin-1, can produce Th1 or Th2, can alter Treg cell control. Now we get Th17 goes out of control, and once it goes out of control, it can cause inflammation, in Aubrey's case, in the brain, and now we got brain fog, pain, allergies, gut damage, glandular loss, all the way up to musculoskeletal pain. And it looks a little bit like this. Energy failure, DNA damage, cell breaks, the cell dies, nitric oxide happens. So now we have essential fatty acids to control the membrane. We have alpha lipoic acid and glutathione to help the mitochondria. We have magnesium threonate to help with NMDA receptors. We have methylated folate or hydroxylated folate to help with DNA damage and histone damage. We've also got alpha lipoic acid. We've also got different types of T extracts. We've also got glutathione that helps with nucleus activation and apoptosis. To clear all this out, we have fasting. And there's so many cool things you can do in nutrition that actually stops death because of inflammation of the cell. All right. So as we go through this, you can look at this. The highly sensitive CRP on this person is up. This is Aubrey. This is a little bit up on her heart, but she's a little bit inflamed. And she ended up having a positive strep culture, and her ASO and DNA ACE was up. Just to let y'all know, it's not on here. So step 3, the end organ damage, inflammation markers and stuff like that. So we got to go down here, and we got to see what the heck's up, what's been damaged. So there's a Th17 response, and now we have cross-reactivity. Is there anything going on? So is there any problems with neurotoxins? Is there any problems with neurotransmitters? Do we have excitotoxicity? What is happening as a result of cytokine expression because of chronic inflammation? Well, we can end up getting neurodegeneration like stroke, Parkinson's disease, neurodegeneration from inflammation like microglial activation like chronic traumatic encephalopathy. We don't control inflammation, and we get all kinds of things like Alzheimer's disease, supranuclear palsy, frontotemporal dementia. Any of these neurological disorders can happen from inflammation. The inflammation crosses the blood-brain barrier. There's blood-brain barrier markers, but they can go in and damage oligodendrocytes, activate microglial cells, damage cell walls, make it to where you don't produce ATP, damage genetic production, and now you get an epigenetic problem in the actual cell. Even though those cells don't undergo mitosis, there's still proteins that are made inside the neurons. Well, here it is. Is myelin damaged? Is your blood-brain barrier damaged? Look at this, peripheral neuropathy, GM1, way high, way high. So now we've got a child that has markers that I'll show you in a little bit for brain, and they also have markers for peripheral nerves, and their body hurts and their nerves hurt. So now we have somebody that, they want to do something to stop the nerve pain on this patient. The patient has HSV1, and the patient has cerebellar antibodies. So now we have somebody that is a little bit ataxic, a little bit clumsy. They have gliadin, which is cross-reacting with the cerebellum. She also has Hashimoto's that is cross-reacting with the cerebellum. The tissue transglutaminases are cross-reacting with the cerebellum. So that damages their coordination, and the cerebellums are what make the frontal lobes develop, which inhibits the direct pathway so you don't perseverate on things and become obsessive and compulsive. So when we look at this, it goes along perfectly with what we see clinically with this patient. We can also run any of these if we want. I just wanted to throw them up just in case we have soft tissue stuff like scleroderma and histones and chromatins. I had a kid just the other day that came in with scleroderma after having pain undiagnosed for a long period of time. So really what we want to do is we want to determine the triggers, cellular responses, and then the end organ damage. And in this patient, Aubrey, I'll give you the final scenario. She had antibodies to calcium calmodulin, or she had a calcium calmodulin system that was abnormal, so she was making too much dopamine. And she had D1 receptor antibodies. And so her basal ganglia, the direct loop, was very, very ramped up. Her cerebellum was very, very damaged. The frontal lobe inhibits that direct pathway. She had an infectious disease. She had gut dysbiosis. You put those two things together, she had inflammation. It created autoimmunity. She had blood-brain barrier antibodies. It crossed into the blood-brain barrier, attacked the neostriatum. Dopamine became very efficient in the direct pathway. And so everything that she thought about and all of her limbic stuff manifested reflexogenically. She couldn't inhibit it. This child had pediatric autoimmune encephalitis. We treated it by controlling the guts, controlling inflammation, stopping the infectious disease, and then we gave her things that modulated T reg cells. And then we went back and we did frontal lobe activation, activated the indirect pathway, and she is back to normal again. She is a child again. She's whole. So this is really quick, 30 minutes, maybe a little bit longer, but I just want to kind of run through the triggers, the cellular responses, and the end organ damage. Obviously, we could talk about this much, much longer, but I wanted to give you a little bit of taste of what it's like to be a child that has an unresolved infection one day and the next day has what looks like mental illness. So I hope you enjoy all of the speakers during the summit. I personally can't wait to go through and look at some of these. If any of you want to ever watch any of the lectures that we do, BTB Health Systems does seminars. Our next one's on inflammation and then autoimmunity later on. We do a lot of stuff coming up with biomechanics, with posture, with soft tissue therapy, with autoimmunity, with infectious disease, and making board reviews and stuff like that. So it's very cool to be a part of this, and I'm very thankful. So please enjoy. And if you guys have any questions, I'm sure that you can get a hold of me through the people who put the summit together. Enjoy.